I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demographics, or changes in human population. And on this podcast, I'm going to give you an autobiography. I'm going to describe my life in relatively few words and cover my whole really complicated life in one podcast episode. And normally this would be kind of complicated because the person's life is complicated, and you need to write a book or maybe several volumes of books to cover all the intricacies of one person's life. But in this case, I'm just trying to describe my life experiences as they may relate to this new field I've chosen for myself, demographics and redesigning the human family. If you ask what credentials I have in demography or economics, I have to admit that I have none. I have no PhD or master's degrees in these fields. In fact, I've never taken an economics class or a demography class. I did take a statistics class once, but I didn't complete it. So I don't have a college degree. I have no formal credentials that would say that I am qualified to talk about these topics. However, I do have a lot of life experience, which, if I can describe it for you, you might say, oh yes, that's kind of relevant to demographic doom. With that in mind, I'm going to dive into my life. Because I'm talking about only demographic doom, I can gloss over big portions of my life. For example, the first 32 years, I can just skip over them, and other big hunks of my life can be ignored, and we'll just focus on these maybe dozen data points that might be relevant to my current project. So what should I say about the first 32 years? Well, only about 3 or 4 things. I am a baby boomer. I was born circa 1960. I never knew I was a baby boomer until years later, because at the time I was born, World War II seemed far, far away. One characteristic of being a baby boomer is I lived in a suburban neighborhood with a lot of big families. So my own family was only moderately large. There were 4 kids. But my next door neighbors had 6 and 8 kids, and the family with 8 kids had lots of foster kids. So at times there might have been 10 kids in that household. These were both Catholic families, and at the time Catholics did not believe in birth control. They still don't believe in birth control, but back then they practiced it. So babies would just kind of pop out every 2 years without any constraints. So I understand the baby boom from the inside, and I understand I've seen big families up close. I've seen the dysfunction of big families up close. And I've seen how my own community changed. My suburb of Bedford in the Boston area. When I was growing up, there were 4 elementary schools, and those schools had big classes. That's due to the baby boom. There were lots of children they had to educate. So we had 4 elementary schools, and right now there are only 2 elementary schools with small classes, and that's the effect of the baby boom petering out to what it is now, where people have only 1 or 2 kids. The other thing you might want to know about my first 32 years is that as a teenager, as an adolescent, I was very into math and science, and read a lot of science fiction. This is, of course, long before the internet. The only entertainment you have was some very limited TV shows and reading. So I did a lot of reading, and I focused on science fiction, imagining future worlds and future ways of living. So I would have hit B.F. Skinner and Aldous Huxley, and my main guy was Arthur C. Clarke. I did a little bit of Asimov, but the same idea is imagining future worlds. And I was imagining future worlds because my own world wasn't all that pleasant, and it was nice to project into the future. I pretty much gave that up as I entered adulthood, but it's still part of my DNA, this science fiction bent. We can just fast forward through my first 32 years. I went to college but didn't complete it. Didn't really see college as relevant. College to me was just an excuse to travel. I went to several different colleges, including USC for one semester in Southern California and the University of Alaska Fairbanks for a year, so I get to winter in Alaska. But I didn't complete any degree program. Now, in my late 20s, I got involved in computers. Back in my late 20s was when the first personal computers came out. This was the Apple II computer and the IBM PC and eventually the Macintosh. That all came out in my late 20s, and I taught myself how to program those machines, which were pretty simple back then. I could actually teach myself machine language to program the Apple II and the IBM PC. And I got a job making software for banks. And this is relevant to the Demographic Doom project because it gave me a little bit of exposure to economic theory and banking theory. Not a lot, but it gave me a little bit of exposure to how banks work and how economics works. The important thing about that project is that this was a startup company, and I eventually was able to cash out and have some money. So around 1992, I had some money to essentially retire, what seemed like retiring. I had enough money to coast along for a few years, and I looked around for adventures. And what drew me in was UFOs. So back in my adolescence, I was into science fiction. I was also into UFO stories and UFO claims. There was a series of books by Frank Edwards called UFOs Serious Business. And I took that all very seriously at the time. I purged it in adulthood because what I realized very early on about UFOs is that even if they're real, they are not relevant to my life on Earth. Yes, they may be coming to Earth every now and then, but they leave pretty quickly and they don't really leave a big footprint. They may abduct people, but they bring them back. And I came to realize UFOs is a red herring in my youth and just gave it up. But now that I had some money and some time, I decided to take up UFOs again. And this time was just as an intellectual challenge. There seemed to be some data in the UFO claims, these stories of somebody encountering some craft or encountering some alien. And some of these stories were very, very credible sounding. And there seemed that there might be some data there. But there was also a whole hell of a lot of noise. And the challenge was how to tease out the data from the noise. And back at this time, roughly the early 1990s, we're still in the paper era. Although computers existed, the internet did not exist. And if you wanted any information about UFOs, you had to order physical paper magazines or paper books. So I delved into the UFO literature at the time, looked at all the UFO magazines at the time, and found that there was this one place where you can supposedly see UFOs on a scheduled basis. And that place was called Area 51. And that began my Area 51 adventure. I'm best known to the public as an expert on Area 51. I've been on dozens of TV shows, have been featured in lots of news articles in the 1990s and in TV shows right up until about 2015. You can sometimes be cruising through cable TV. You see a show like on the History Channel about UFOs at Area 51, and there I am speaking as some kind of an expert. So if you want a little proof that I was actually involved with Area 51, there are tons of articles online, but the main one that kind of captures what I was doing is in the New York Times in 1994. There was a big feature article about me and about the issues at Area 51. You can find that on my website, glenn-campbell.com. Just kind of pull down one of those menus and you'll see this Glenn in New York Times article. So what happened around 1992 is I started to focus on Area 51, and Area 51 was the place where you could see UFOs on a supposedly scheduled basis. There was an old faithful UFO that would supposedly show up over Area 51 every Wednesday morning at a certain time, like 5:45 a.m. You just go to this desert location called the Black Mailbox, and you look out toward Area 51, and sure enough, at 5:45 in the morning, this bright pulsating orb would appear above Area 51, and that was supposedly when they're testing the alien craft they have. And the Area 51 claims all come from Bob Lazar, a Las Vegas resident who claimed to have worked with alien craft at a facility in the Nevada desert near Area 51. It's sort of embedded in this huge military area. And that's what started the whole Area 51 craze. But my role is to make it mainstream, to bring it mainstream. So between 1989 and 1993, this was a fringe story only known to UFO buffs. And through 1994 and 1995, it blew up into a big public phenomenon where everyone knew what Area 51 was, and it was covered by major publications, mainstream publications, and the first paranormal TV shows. I bear some responsibility or blame for bringing Area 51 to the public attention. If you've heard the name Area 51, that's partly my responsibility, because my job, as I saw it, was to systematize the information available about Area 51. So I was coming into an environment. Oh, by the way, that UFO that was hovering over the base, yes, it shows up every Wednesday morning at 5:45, but it also shows up every other morning at 5:45. And after a couple of nights of watching, I realized what that light was. That light was a plane. It was a crew plane, a 737 crew plane, bringing workers to Area 51. Area 51 is a real military base that's used to test secret aircraft. And the workers mostly come to the base by planes from McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, and they fly a certain flight path, and at the last end of their flight path, before they get to Area 51, these planes are flying directly at you. So if you're at this black mailbox and you're looking toward Area 51, these planes with their bright landing lights are flying toward you. So this looks like a hovering orb. It is just stuck in the sky for a certain amount of time until it kind of turns and slides down into Area 51. So I had explained that UFO, but there are many other UFOs in the area. And I came to realize there was just one trip in 1992, and I came to realize that there are many other phenomena there that need to be explored. And this was a perfect environment for what I saw as my skills of data collection. So I actually moved to the nearest town near Area 51 called Rachel, Nevada. I moved there in 1993, and I spent about 2.5 years there, writing what I called the Area 51 Viewer's Guide. So I was taking all the data available at the time. This is pre-internet, taking all the data available at the time and putting into this big document that I called the Viewer's Guide that would help you look for the UFOs yourself. And at the same time you're looking for the UFOs, I could explain to you that most of these things are not UFOs. So I was a neutral data collector. I wasn't taking a position. I was just saying, well, so this old faithful UFO at 5:45 is not what the other watches claim it is. So this big document, I worked on this for many months and I continued to revise and add to it for years. This Area 51 Viewer's Guide became the basis for the mainstream media being able to pick up this story, because at the time, the mainstream media did not touch UFOs. No TV show would touch UFOs. That was just too crazy. They failed at the time to realize what a gold mine, what a ratings gold mine it would be. So I kind of breached the era between where respectable media wouldn't touch UFOs to the era when everyone reported on UFOs and no claim was too outrageous to report. I could go on and on about Area 51, but the important thing is, what did I learn that's relevant to my demographic doom project? So this is my first big data collection project, where I'm collecting all the data about Area 51 and putting it into a document and putting it into files. And that's the beginning of that's one of my great data collection episodes. I had 3 of these data collection episodes. I'll get into the other one, which is Family Court, and my 3rd data collection episode is the Demographic Doom Project, where I'm collecting articles about demography. Area 51 to me was like a master's level program in a lot of important skills other than UFOs. I learned about how governments work and how the law works and how media works, how to use the media to get your message across. I learned a lot about television production because I was involved in so many of them. I was there as an on-camera presence to guide a TV crew to a viewpoint overlooking the base. I was also a fixer, essentially, to set up everything up for the film crew to make sure that everything went smoothly. And I learned an awful lot about how to make videos and how to record sound and things like that, which has all gone into my video section of the Demographic Doom Project. I also learned that these things can quickly take over your life, and they can just suck the life out of you. I was essentially providing a free public service to journalists and to the public, and I was collecting all sorts of information, not just on UFOs, but on all sorts of paranormal phenomena. My website was getting bigger and bigger, and it was eating me alive until the Y2K bug just wiped everything out. Now, that's not exactly true. When January 1st, 2000 came along, my websites were not wiped out, but I decided that was a good time to just give it all up. So starting from about, I would say that my Area 51 era ran from roughly late 1992 through the Y2K bug. The next big adventure of my life is that I got married. And that was a total disaster. I got married to a woman who had 4 kids from a deeply dysfunctional family where there were drug-addicted relatives. So we ended up taking some of those kids into our house. So at one point we had 8 kids in one house. I used my money that I still had to buy us a house, to get a mortgage on a house in Las Vegas. So from about 1998 till about 2005, I was a married man with a married family man. I had a big family. So you can't say that I have no experience raising kids. I do. I realized the huge challenge of it, especially when you did not raise the kids yourself. Because I came into a family that already existed, already had its culture, and I was really relatively powerless to change this existing culture. I spent all my time putting out fires in this family, and one of the biggest fires was my wife herself, who was a wonderful person until the day that we got married, and then she started becoming highly abusive. And I learned later that she had borderline personality disorder, and I did not have a clue about this before I got married. I was familiar with the diagnostic manual, the DSM of mental illnesses, and I was aware of a disease called borderline disorder, but I had never experienced it until I got married, and it's just the most horrible thing in the world. The best way to describe it is Donald Trump. You know what Donald Trump is like. If someone insults him, even in the slightest, just slightly insults him, he's going to hit back with full force. And the way he usually hits back is by accusing you of the very same thing that you would accuse him of. And that's my wife, but even worse. My wife without any bearing in reality, because as soon as we got married, I was the provider, and that allowed her to become more dysfunctional. Until we got married, She was the sole provider for these 4 kids. And then when I came along, I picked up the slack, and she became a child. She became an invalid. She spent all her days in bed and with all sorts of various imagined illnesses, and just abusing me horribly. So I stuck it out. I lived in the household for some 5 years, and it took another 2 years to get the divorce. But it was the worst experience of my adult life, really the central experience of my adult life. All other experiences, I have plenty of traumas in my life, but nothing that comes close to that, because I can't live in the household, yet I feel the obligation to support the household, even though everyone's abusing me. And how do I extract myself? How do I give these children back to this dysfunctional woman without screwing up the children? I had taken a responsibility to help raise these children, and their mother was in no position to raise them. So how do I extract myself from this very difficult situation? And fortunately, this was mostly taken out of my hands by my wife's craziness. And ultimately, we had bought this house in 1998 in Las Vegas, and my wife's craziness forced me to file for divorce. We eventually sold the house, and we sold it at the peak of the market. As we all know, that in 2007, 2008, the housing crashed in Las Vegas and many other places. And because I went through this divorce, we were able to sell this house at a profit in roughly 2005. There was enough money, enough cash left over that I could give most of the cash to her. She left the state with her children, and the problem was no longer mine again. So I had the opportunity to experience all the pleasures and pain of parenthood without any long-term cost, because the children were taken away from me. My wife took her money and left the state, and I didn't see the children again. The most difficult part of this era was that I mentioned that my wife had drug-addicted relatives. We were in the process of adopting a child. So my wife's children didn't see me as their dad, because they had real dads. I was the fake dad. So I never really had much of a bond with these other kids. But there was one child I did have a bond with, and that's a child of the drug-addicted relative who we raised from scratch. We raised her from the age of about 2 months to the age of about 5 years. And she was my child, and she alone called me daddy. And we were bonded to each other, and this child was ripped away from me because we're in the process of adopting the child, but my wife cracked up before the adoption went through, and I had no say on the child because I was not a blood relative of the child. I had no rights, and I didn't even have the right to see the child again. My wife had thoroughly poisoned me with the social workers and everyone else, claiming I had done all sorts of imaginary terrible things. So I was not allowed to see the child. I raised the child from age 2 months to 5 years. It was traumatic because we had to keep giving the baby back to its mother. The mother would clean herself up temporarily of the drugs, and she'd take the children back, and then she'd fall back into drugs again. So that was very traumatic. But throughout all of this was my child, and I lost this child. This is a very great trauma in my life. And to deal with this trauma, I became an expert in family court. So this is kind of typical of how I approach things. Whenever I'm facing a stress, I start systematizing things, and I start focusing on data collection and trying to turn this into something useful. And the loss of my daughter turned into about 2.5 years as a observer of family court. Family court is the building in Las Vegas where all family-related issues are handled. And those issues include divorce and child welfare and juvenile justice. So these are all housed in one courthouse. And I started sitting in on court hearings. So how this is relevant to the Demographic Doom Project is I saw firsthand the effects of a lot of abuse cases. It's not a nice cross-section of humanity, but I saw all the ways that parenting breaks down. There were a lot of typical abuse case might be drug abuse. The parents are caught using drugs while they have the children in their custody, so the children are temporarily taken away, and the adults have to go through a case plan to show that they've gotten off of drugs before getting their children back. I also greatly enjoyed juvenile justice, sitting in on the juvenile justice courtrooms. In Las Vegas, all of these courtrooms are open to the public. They don't broadcast this, but most of the court cases that come through this family court are open to the public. So I sat in on a lot of court cases for juvenile justice and for child abuse and neglect, and a few divorce cases. So I got a pretty broad understanding of all of these family dysfunctions, all the ways that families can go bad. Now, as for you want me to prove any of this, these things that I'm saying, there was one article in the Las Vegas Sun, 2005. You can find it on my website, glenn-campbell.com. So there's this long feature article in the Las Vegas Sun about me and my crusade in family court. During the course of my marriage, I went from having positive net assets to negative net assets. So I experienced the pain of debt and how debt can gang up on you, and how it just kind of sneaks up on you, and as you borrow more and more money and you go through various forms of denial as it gradually sinks you. I got out of debt eventually by filing for bankruptcy, which was kind of like winning the lottery in reverse. Instead of getting a lot of cash, I got a lot of debts wiped out all at once. So when I talk about the big international debt crisis that's coming down on us, I kind of understand the psyche of just about everybody who's finds themselves in debt. Like Area 51, the family court thing just kind of ran out of steam over time. I had a website and was putting out a newsletter, but I had to get a job. And the job I eventually got in 2007 was I worked for an airline. I saw this ad. I realized I got to get a job. I got the Sunday newspaper. I opened up the Sunday newspaper. The first ad I saw was for baggage handlers for U.S. Airways at McCarran Airport. And this was just the perfect thing for me. I went through the process, got all the credentials, and I became a baggage handler for 1 year for U.S. Airways. So what's special about being a baggage handler? The main thing that's special about it is free travel. So if you're an airline employee, you can get on a plane anytime you want. As long as there are seats available, I can get on any U.S. Airways flight and just pop on over to Paris or Venice or someplace like that. And the only trouble is that I had to get back to Las Vegas in time for my regular shift. So what a baggage handler does is they load and unload the baggage from the bottom of the plane. They also do that thing with the wands where they guide the plane into the parking spot. They hook up the plane with power and water. And that's about it. That's what a baggage handler does. So it was the great job for me until it ended. And the only thing that could be better than free flight is free flight without having to work for it. And that happened to me in 2008. So the financial crash of 2008 was actually pretty good to me. I got laid off from U.S. Air. U.S. Airways decided to close their entire hub in Las Vegas. They had a hub, meaning that a lot of people would come into Las Vegas, change planes, and fly out on other planes. And they closed this hub and laid off hundreds of baggage handlers. And I was one of them because you're laid off based on seniority. But because I'm laid off and not actually fired, they can call me back at any time. I'm not going to be called back because my seniority is so low. And as long as I'm on this callback period, I still get to keep my free flight. And this was like winning the lottery to me, because instead of just going to Paris and spending 24 hours there and turning around and coming back, I could go to Paris and spend 2 weeks or as long as I wanted. The only thing I needed was some sort of financial support. I needed to make enough money to support this free wheeling lifestyle. And to do that, I cooked up this idea of driving cars and pets across the country. This is my own idea. I knew of some of my coworkers on the ramp. They drove RVs from the manufacturer to the customer. And what they would do is they'd use their free flight to go get the RVs and then drive them across the country. And I said, well, I should do that for cars, because there must be a lot of people who need to get their cars someplace. And more importantly, they need to get their pets someplace. Let's say you're moving from New York to Los Angeles, and you need to move your car, but you also need to move your pet. And I created a website for this when I knew I was going to be laid off. And before I got laid off, I got my first gig, driving from, I think, New York to Austin. And that's continued ever since. So I continue to be a driver of cars and pets, and I did a lot of flying during those 4 years. During the 3 years of my layoff, I flew to all over Europe. Went to all the cities that U.S. Airways serves, and then I started taking little trips away from those cities to find little corners of Europe. Made a lot of trips to Israel. Eventually, I crossed overland from Israel to Egypt, which I definitely don't recommend these days. And so I got a lot of travel. I got a lot out of those 3 years of free travel. I would literally fly for free once or twice a week, and then fly overseas maybe once a month. If I just got bored one day, I could pop over to Venice, Italy, spend a couple days in Venice, Italy. I didn't have money, very little money throughout this whole period. So I stayed in a lot of hostels. There was a little bit of cost involved. It might cost me $30 round trip to fly to Venice, Italy. And then I would be very frugal when I'm there and spend only a few dollars each day. I would stay at a lot of hostels and really conserve my resources. So the only bad thing that could happen is that I would lose that wonderful feature of free flight. And this kind of bore down on me. I knew that in 2011 I was going to lose my free flight. And what I would lose is I'd lose the ability to fly for free to my driving gigs. And I would also lose the ability just to pop over to Europe whenever I wanted. So this was really a traumatic worry for me throughout 2011. And when I finally lost my flight privileges, I finally came up with a solution. And that solution was raise my prices. So I increased my rates for driving cars across the country to cover the airfare. So now I'm paying for my own airfare to get to my drives. But I'm not paying a lot because I'm arranging all of these drives well in advance. And I'm collecting something called frequent flyer miles. So essentially, I still get to keep my free flight. I've been to 87 countries, mostly in the past 12 years. I've flown around the world. I've been everywhere, done everything, especially in North America and in Europe. I've dabbled in Asia. I've been to about 13 countries in Africa. I've seen extreme poverty, extreme wealth. I visited a lot of countries where population is falling and there are a lot of abandoned buildings. So that's what I continue to do today. I spend my days driving, often with a very nice dog. I get to meet a lot of nice dogs and a few little rotten dogs. When I'm driving, I have lots of time to think. And I have lots of time to read when I'm driving. And the way I read is that I have my iPhone read to me. I can read articles, I can listen to videos, listen to podcasts. So my driving time is very productive for me. Lots of time to think about things, to piece together my demographic doom project. Another thing that happened to me recently is last year, 2018, I got cancer. So I was feeling kind of poor. For several months, I had some mystery symptoms, numbness in my jaw, and great weakness, physical weakness. I went to my doctor about it. We were kind of trying to figure things out. But for 3 months, we didn't know what was causing my fatigue and my curious symptoms. And then I'm driving in Colorado. I'm not feeling very good. I remember driving, putting the car's cruise control on in the right lane. And then the next thing I remember is waking up in an ambulance. And what had happened is I had a seizure on the highway. I had an accident, but fortunately it was very minor, only minor damage to the car. The car slid to a halt against a guardrail on one side of the highway. They supposedly had to break a window to get me out because I wasn't responding. And then I woke up in an ambulance. I was taken in the ambulance to Grand Junction, Colorado. And there in the hospital, I learned that I had massive cancer throughout my body. The CAT scans revealed lumps everywhere in my body. And what this was is a cancer called lymphoma, which it's a cancer of the blood that collects in the lymph nodes throughout the body. And it was everywhere. And the reason I blacked out is I had a huge tumor in my head pressing on my brain. It was first assumed to be a brain tumor, but it turned out it was outside the brain, pressing in on the brain, and that's what caused the seizure. So this was the 4th of July of 2018, I suddenly realized that I'm probably going to die. I didn't feel too badly about it. I felt I had a good enough life. And what was interesting about this tumor in my head is that it pressed on the right temporal lobe of my brain, which I surmise also pressed on the amygdala of my brain, which is a moderator on the right side of the brain of all the bad feelings and bad emotions. So you had this pressure on the amygdala. And what that meant is that I didn't feel much anxiety. Although I was facing what seemed like certain death at the time, I felt very little anxiety. I felt okay about it. I felt not really scared at all. And I could attribute this to pressure on the amygdala. The whole experience of having cancer was really wonderful. I really enjoyed myself. And I attribute that as much to me, my attitude toward life, than about the experience itself, because most of my fellow patients were really miserable. I just had a grand old time at this big adventure that I was having. Treatment was amazingly successful. Within 2 rounds of chemotherapy, almost all of those tumors had gone away. So July 11th was when I was diagnosed, and by the end of August, all of the cancer had vanished from the scans. Now I had to keep going through chemotherapy because they don't stop when the cancer becomes invisible. They want to keep hitting me with chemotherapy to kill all the cancer the little cancer cells that might be floating around. So I had to keep going through cancer therapy. The main effect of cancer therapy is that it makes you very, very physically weak because you're killing off red blood cells. You don't have a lot of red blood cells, and they allow the red blood cells to fall to a certain level, and then they give you an infusion of someone else's red blood cells. So at certain phases of this chemotherapy, I had great difficulty walking. But as long as I'm lying in bed, my brain is still fully functional. As long as I'm lying in bed, I can still work on my computer. I can still be fairly productive every day. And I enjoyed this since I live on the road and have no permanent relationships. this was one opportunity. These 80 days in the hospital were the only time in my life in a decade when I had a real community. I had nurses that I knew and people that I liked, and real friends, physical friends as opposed to virtual friends. So I would say cancer was a great experience for me. Once it was clear I'm going to live, cancer was a great experience. What I learned from cancer relative to demographic doom is the absolutely huge cost of healthcare. I had pretty good insurance. My insurance paid out about $500,000 to keep me alive, and it sensitized me to the huge costs of healthcare and how you just can't give $500,000 of treatment to every patient that comes along. Eventually, there's a good chance that I'll have the cancer back. This is the kind of cancer that could reemerge, in which case they'll throw another $500,000 at me. And you just can't do that for everybody. There has to be a breaking point in the healthcare costs. So that was a little diversion, a little 6-month diversion. My demographic doom project actually began on the 9th of November, 2016. And we all know what happened on the 8th of November, 2016. That's when Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. And like many people, I was very traumatized by this. And I was looking for solutions. How can so many people be so stupid? And the first answer I came up with was, well, it must be a breeding issue. It must be that all the stupid people of the world are breeding with each other and having a lot of kids. And over time, this makes us a stupider nation. And I attributed this to birth control. If birth control was invented in the 1960s, and the people most likely to take advantage of birth control are the most intelligent, the most educated, and the stupider people can't even figure out how to work birth control. So I thought this would account for why Donald Trump was elected. It turns out I was wrong, because the bulk of the voters for Donald Trump are from my era, are from the pre-birth control era, the baby boom era. It's the frickin' old people who voted for Donald Trump. So the whole theory of birth control kind of disturbing the gene pool really didn't hold water. But in the process, I got exposed to demography, and that I began to realize that the real issue here is not Donald Trump. The real issue here is the falling populations, the falling birth rates around the world, and all the devastating effects that's going to have. So the project started November 9th, 2016. For the first couple of years, I was focused on the disaster itself. And this is why I named my project Demographic Doom, because I wanted to tell everybody about the doom that's coming down upon us, the financial disaster that's coming down upon us. And we still have breeding issues, the fact that the most intelligent people in society are not having babies. But after the cancer kind of distracted me for a while, and while I was in the ward with cancer, I focused on the cancer itself. I started writing a book about the cancer, about my cancer experiences, which is I just see as therapy more than anything else. I never finished the book, but to write a book as you're going through a traumatic experience, that's a very useful form of therapy. And then after the cancer cleared, roughly the beginning of this year, 2019, I got back into my Demographic Doom project, and I shifted focus from just predicting doom and gloom to trying to design a new family, a new kind of structure to address all of these issues I saw. So I'm not going to give up on humanity, and there's not much point in me telling the world that the sky is falling, because no one's going to listen to me. But I can think about what is the next step after the sky does fall. What is the next step for humanity, and how do we preserve the best of humanity?